Thanks, Ashley. It's really great to be here this morning. And I have to start by commending all of you for giving up your Saturday morning, or I guess in one case, Saturday evening in England, um, to come here to be in this space together and learn. It is my hope that this tiny little snippet of Canada's and Western Canada's and Alberta's and specifically Calgary's Black history will stay with you and will spark in you the desire to learn more, perhaps to do the kind of work that I do in your futures. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it is that I will not have time to tell all the stories that should be told in my lifetime. And these little introductions that I'm going to make today are not comprehensive. For every story I share, please believe me, there are 15 other stories that I don't even have time to show you an image of. And there's just so much more to learn about and to share. I want to begin with my own land acknowledgement. I honor and acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, where I live, which includes the Niitsitapi or Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising of the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, region number 3. It's always very important to me to acknowledge the territory where I live, and not just the territory, but the deep relationships of family, other kinds of kinship and friendship that have existed between my African ancestors, including my most immediate African ancestors, and the indigenous people of the territories in which we've lived. Black history spans all of Canada. So the first part of my presentation is just going to whistle through what I mean when I say that. Of course, our history spans the entire range of human activity and experience that includes great joy and great pain. And it may seem a little bit as though I'm focusing on the struggles more in this history, because I think we can't get away from that. We cannot get away from our experience of racism in this part of the world. And also much of our activism and the impact that we've had in this part of the world springs from those struggles that we've had. But please also know that we have done everything and experienced everything. We have made all kinds of contributions that are connected in small ways to our struggles, but are not only because of our struggles. And I won't have time today, perhaps, to focus as much on the joy as I would like, but I don't want you to go away thinking that that's all I know of our history, or that's all that I want to share. Going to start sharing my screen at this point. Okay, can everybody see that slide? Mm-hmm. So there are many resources that help us to understand the extent of Black history in Canada. And many of you may have a collection of stamps that comes out every February, the Black History Month stamps that Canada Post has been putting out now for, I think, about 15 years. And I thought I would just as a way of talking about Black history across the vastness of this country, share a few of the images of the Black History Month stamps. You probably know that Ashley has history in Nova Scotia and specifically rooted in Africville and other parts of the Halifax area through her dad, George. Um, Africville was a community of people of African descent who endured incredible struggle, but thrived and made a beautiful life. And then, unfortunately, the land that they were on turned out to be incredibly valuable land. So they were displaced from that land, and yet the spirit of Africville has never died. And a lot of our knowledge of Black history in Canada begins with and resides in Nova Scotia. So I'm going to share a few other Black History Month stamps that relate specifically to Nova Scotia, including this one about the history of Black hockey in Canada. And you can see from the uniforms that these fellows are wearing that this is a very old history and goes back to the beginnings of hockey in Canada as well. And then perhaps some of you know the story of Viola Desmond because she is the first Black Canadian to have been featured on money. She's on the $10. She was on the $10 bill recently, and I have my own collection of $10 bills with the image of Viola Desmond, who mounted a protest against segregation of theaters in Canada and in Nova Scotia specifically in 1946, I believe it was. Very interesting story, which you can find other resources to tell you more about, and I will refer back to her a little bit later. But I do want to also say that we tend to think of the Black Atlantic experience as having lived only in Nova Scotia. And of course, that is not the case. Last year, or I guess earlier this year in February, the Canada Post stamp featured two communities. The first that I'll talk about is Willow Grove, New Brunswick. There's Black history in Newfoundland. There's Black history in Prince Edward Island. There's Black history in Labrador. And these are all stories that are just crying out for some of you folks to dig deeper in and perhaps make the subject of your thesis when you study. Just moving a little bit further across the country now to the 2009 stamp that featured Rosemary Brown, who was the first Black Canadian member of Parliament, an amazing woman. She was based on the West Coast, and Abraham Shadd, whose Black history in Ontario goes back to the 1830s and is connected to the community of Buxton, Ontario. Another amazing history. If you ever get a chance to go to the Buxton reunion that's held every September, I highly recommend it because it's one of the few historic Black communities that still exists and is still more or less in the hands of the descendants of the original inhabitants who created that amazing Black community going back now 150 years or more. I have a friend, Violet Shadd, who is a direct descendant of that history, and that's the reason that I've had the pleasure of attending that reunion. But anybody can go. Albert Jackson is believed to have been Canada's first letter carrier. And his story is very rooted in Black protest and the ways in which we have supported each other down through our centuries here in this country, because his white colleagues refused to train him and to allow him to be a letter carrier. And it was only the protest that was mounted by the Black community on his behalf that led to him becoming the first black letter carrier in Canada. It's a history I connect to because my father was, I think, probably the first black letter carrier in Calgary when I was growing up. That's what my dad did for a living. On the back of each of the collections of stamps, you can get more information about the people and the stories that I'm sharing. It's a really lovely project, and I appreciate it very much. And I know there are teachers in the country who use the annual Black History Month stamp as an introduction to Black history in Canada. This one represents the community of Hogan's Alley in Vancouver, which was another thriving Black community that shares the unfortunate history of many thriving Black communities, which was it was eventually bulldozed to make way for a highway. But it was incredible history. And there's a Hogan's Alley committee of Black citizens, mostly in Vancouver, that have now revived the memory of the history and have arranged for representation of that community on that spot. The woman in this picture is Nora Hendricks. She was Jimi Hendrix's. Are you all too young to know who Jimi Hendrix was? Can I see some heads nodding? Of course, probably the greatest guitar player of all time, anywhere in the world ever. And most people don't know that he has a very powerful connection to Canada, that his mother, his father and his grandmother were very active in the Hogan's Alley community. Nora Hendricks was a cook at Vi's Chicken Restaurant, and all our little Black communities in Western Canada for sure had our own chicken restaurants, which you'll hear a bit more about later. An incredible woman, and Jimi Hendrix spent much of his life growing up in Vancouver, and that's where he honed his skills as a musician. The other stamp that was created this past February was a stamp that is close to my heart because it is of the community of Amber Valley, Alberta, of which both Ashley and I are descendants as well. Amber Valley was the largest and best known of 5 small Black communities that were created by what we call the Black Migration of 1910. At that time, between 1,500 and 2,000 Black people migrated, mostly from Oklahoma, but from other southern states, into Western Canada for 2 reasons. One, because Oklahoma became a state officially starting in 1905, and it was all said and done by 1907. Prior to that, Oklahoma was divided between 2 territories, one that was called the Western Territory and one that was called the Indian Territory. So when I look at the birth certificates of both of my maternal grandparents, one was born in Indian Territory, Oklahoma, or Indian Territory, USA, and one was born in Western Territory, USA. But the state of Oklahoma was created in their lifetime. My great-grandparents, Rufus and Drusilla Smith, were living on Frankfort Avenue in Tulsa, which is 1 block over from Greenwood Avenue in Tulsa. And if any of you have ever heard of Black Wall Street and the Tulsa Massacre of 1921, you will recognize that Greenwood Avenue was the center of Black excellence in all of the United States. There was no more successful Black community in the United States than that of the community of Greenwood. That was the reason, it was a big part of the reason for the establishment of the state of Oklahoma, because white America could not abide the success of this community, which was far outstripped the success of any other community in the United States, or in the territory that became Oklahoma, not in the United States, but it outstripped white success by far. It was just block after block of dentists and doctors and architects and successful people of every stripe. And my great-grandparents were a part of that community. They left that area 10 years before the massacre happened in Tulsa for the reasons that led to the massacre. That hate that caused the state of Oklahoma to be formed in order to brutalize, kill, destroy, burn down these successful Black communities that lived there were the conditions that caused those 1,500 to 2,000 people that I referenced earlier to flee that part of the world. So our history is very closely linked to the history of the Tulsa massacre. It is without question my great-grandparents and my grandparents, who were very young at that time when they left, would have had friends that died in that massacre or who had their livelihoods destroyed. The second reason for the migration was that the Canadian government was wanting to continue the displacement of indigenous people on these lands in Western Canada and fill that territory up with settlers and homesteaders who would do this terrible thing that they called it, break the land, clear the trees, make it land that you could plant on. And they just wanted to bring in more and more and more homesteaders and settlers. Because of the brutality that my ancestors and their 1,500 colleagues and friends and family members were experiencing in Oklahoma, they saw those advertisements as well that the Canadian government was putting forward. And they were, for the most part, very spiritual people, the majority of them Christians, who believed that those two events happening at the same time meant that they were being called to this part of the world as the promised land that they had been seeking when they went to the territories in the first place, just looking for a place of peace and safety and where they could exercise their skills, talents, and brilliance and create the kinds of communities that they wanted to live in. So they came to this part of the world and established those communities. But unfortunately, the Canadian government was not expecting nor happy to see Black people answering that call that they were putting out for Americans to come north and settle in this part of the world. And I'll be sharing a bit more of what the reception was that they received when they came. This is the back of the Amber Valley stamp, which gives you a little bit more information about the community. And this is the stamp itself. One of the people on this stamp is the woman on my right. I'm not sure how you're seeing it, is Amy Brody, who was a very famous midwife in Northern Alberta and specifically in the Amber Valley community. And when I say she was famous to us. She's just now starting to receive the kind of recognition that she should have received and that all the Black pioneer midwives should have received. It's an incredible history. My oldest daughter, Chandra, is a midwife, and she did a paper during her studies on the Black pioneer midwives and plans to expand that study because it's incredible, including my great-grandmother, Drusilla Smith, who I mentioned earlier, was also a midwife. My favorite of all the stamps is the John Ware stamp, and I'll be sharing a little bit more about John Ware as we move along as well. He was a Black cowboy who came to Southern Alberta in 1882, then carried on to become the Jimi Hendrix of cowboys, the greatest of all time, anywhere ever, greatest cowboy. And his life has become a bit of an obsession and a field of study for me. And as I say, I'll share more about that. And I will end with this one of the Canada Post stamps just because it represents that our history spans the entire country. And this is a stamp that recognized the number 2 construction battalion, the all Black battalion that was formed for World War I, because Black men wanted to serve Canada and they were segregated from other troops, but they demanded that they be accepted into the Canadian forces for that war. And so they were from all across the country, Black men signed up and they were funneled into the number 2 construction battalion, who, despite being very limited in what they were allowed to do, in spite being segregated, made an incredible contribution. And so for me, this stamp represents the vastness of the Black Canadian community, because as I say, there were Black men from all across the country. My grandfather, Ashley's great-grandfather, George Willis Smith, also served Canada in World War I. He did not get segregated into the number 2 construction battalion, I think because he was very light-skinned. And so he is one of the few Black men who fought for Canada in World War I, who was not part of this battalion. He was part of a Regina, Saskatchewan battalion, which is where he signed up. But just to illustrate that our history covers more territory than what the Canada Post stamps have been able to represent up to this point. This is a story of Quebec Black history. It's a good book that is both about the history of enslavement of Africans in Canada and the burning of old Montreal, for which a young Black woman who was enslaved in Quebec City or in Montreal was hanged. She was accused of burning the whole city down, and she protested her innocence right up until the last moments of her life. Quebec Black history is very big, wide, and deep, and I'm sorry I don't have more time to spend on that. This is William Beale, who lived in the area of Swan Valley, Manitoba, and who arrived in Canada in 1906 and became a very celebrated photographer. You could read more about him in a book called The Black Prairie Archives, an anthology which I highly recommend as an amazing resource if you want to learn more about Black history on the prairies and Black writing and literature on the prairies specifically. And it's not just historical, it goes up to contemporary Black writers as well. He deserves his own stamp one day. I'm sure it's coming. I just posted this photo, which is a photo I took myself at a reunion in northern Saskatchewan that took place in the summer of 2019 that I went to with my cousin Robert from Winnipeg and his wife Teresa and my husband, my oldest daughter, my brother Richard, my mother, her twin sister Pearl, who is Ashley's grandmother. This building was being designated as a Saskatchewan historic site because it is the church that our ancestors built. It was the first building that they collectively built in northern Saskatchewan. So the 5 Black communities that were created by the Black migration of 1910 included 1 in Saskatchewan and 4 in Alberta. And I'm really sorry I won't get to go. I could do a whole 1 hour at least lecture on each of these communities. So please, again, forgive me that these are just little snippets that you're getting. But this was the community, the primary community of both Ashley and my heritage. And this church near Maidstone, Saskatchewan, is the building, the first building that our ancestors created there. It's now a historic, provincial historic site, which you can also go visit. And there's a cemetery beside it. Most Black communities were not allowed to bury their dead in the cemeteries that already existed that were for the use of the white communities. So there are many small Black cemeteries in northern Alberta and this one in northern Saskatchewan. It just happened to be the day, exactly 100 years to the day that my grandparents, George Willis Smith, who I mentioned earlier, who fought for Canada in World War I, and Arena Glover Smith got married. So that little group of us who traveled there for this event also went and stood on the banks of the river where my grandparents and the parents of my mom, Pauline, and her twin sister, Pearl, were married. It was an incredible day. I will never forget that day. It's beautiful. Now, get to my next slide. Just to make sure I don't leave out the Northwest Territories and the Yukon, when I say our history spans every territory, region, and province in this country, it really does. Pete Risby was a very famous miner and prospector who is in the Yukon. I can't remember what it's called, the Yukon Gold Mining Hall of Fame or something like that. There is nowhere that we haven't been and lived and made incredible contributions in this country. So now I'm going to move to my particular area of expertise, and I'm just going to keep my phone handy here so I can make sure I remain on track here. Annie Saunders was one of the first Black residents of southern Alberta. She arrived in 1879. She came with the McLeod family. And I know many of you who live in Calgary know you've driven on McLeod Trail and you've shopped at the McLeod Mall and you've probably driven past Fort McLeod on the highway. That is the family that Annie came to this part of the world with as a nanny for their children. When she left the employ of the McLeods, she stayed in Pincher Creek, Alberta, and ran 3 businesses there that were really integral to the life of the town. So she is one of Alberta's first female entrepreneurs. Never mind first Black female entrepreneur. She is one of the first Black women to run businesses on her own in Alberta. One was a laundry, one was a boarding school, and one was a restaurant that was so famous that it is mentioned in the writings of many of the people, the colonial people like the Marquis of Lorne and other so-called distinguished visitors who would come to southern Alberta, always made sure that they ate at her restaurant, which was called Auntie's. She told everyone to call her Auntie. And I think the reason for that is because she didn't want the N word attached to her name, which is what happened to most of the Black residents of Alberta at that time. They became known as N word so-and-so. She wasn't interested in that. So she said, oh, just call me Auntie. I referenced earlier that our history is very closely linked to the indigenous peoples of the places where we have lived. So this man is Dave Mills, who was an interpreter for the Northwest Mounted Police, as well as a trapper. And his father, Henry Mills, was also in this part of the world in southern Alberta, going back to the 1870s. Dave Mills married a woman from the Blood tribe. Her blood name was Nadawatastaki, which means holy rabbit woman in English. And you can see the arm of their baby dangling there, and the child's face is turned at an angle, looking off sideways. So you can't really see the baby's face, but the Nadawatastaki's mother named her, she called her own face, because she said she has her own face. She doesn't look like anybody else. I think this photo is labeled as Dave Mills as well in the Glenbow archives. I actually think it is probably his father, Henry Mills, or perhaps another Black man who was in the area at the time. But again, it just is illustrative of the strong connections that have existed between our people and First Nation and Métis people in this part of the world going back to the beginning. I'm going to talk a little bit about John Ware, and I chose to use this poster from a presentation that I started working on in 2012, just as an illustration of how long I have been doing this work, excavating, reimagining, and reclaiming the life of John Ware, whose image and story I feel had been sort of co-opted to represent all of Alberta Black history, for one thing, but to represent it in a way that seemed to tell a story about Canada that is only partially true. John Ware, because of his success as a cowboy and a rancher and a neighbor, and a person that we still remember today, even though he died in 1905, his story was held up as a story that was supposed to say there was no racism here. And that is very, very untrue. Often the success of one person is used to berate or chastise other Black people. In fact, my own story is used in that way as well. I have met with a measure of success as a writer, and often people like me and John Ware are pointed to and said, well, why can't, they're proof that there's no racism, or why can't you be like them? That is a narrative that is egregious in its wrongness and completely erases the experiences of racism that people like John Ware and people like me have in our desire to do the things that we want to do in our lives. And it also is used to, we're like the one person that's allowed to do what we do, and it's used in a way to keep others out or to erase other stories. So it's very important for me to acknowledge that there were other Black cowboys. John Ware was not the only Black cowboy that was here. There was and their stories have been erased to the point that there's very little imagery that I can share with you to tell those stories. This is a reference in a newspaper, I think it was the McLeod Gazette, in which a Black cowboy by the name of Jim Whitford was referenced. On this census from, can't even see, I think it was from the 1800s in Alberta. There's the name of Green Walters, who was working as a cowboy in Alberta at that time. There's a little bit more known about him, but again, no photos that have survived. And then this is the only photo that I have found of another Black cowboy who was a contemporary of John Ware, Billy Welsh. But there are others. There are many others as well. Black cowboys and Black people were here before, during, and after John Ware's time. So when you see John Ware held up as a representation of all of Alberta's Black history by some, we can recognize that that is a very harmful and false narrative. These are two of John Ware's sons, Arthur and William Ware, who were part of the number 2 construction battalion in World War I Canada. Sadly, William's lungs were gassed during the war, and so he died quite young in Calgary. And Arthur Ware lived in Hogan's Alley in Vancouver, where he was based in his work as a porter. So I also want you to understand that all of our communities and our people are linked. John Ware's sons are linked to that number 2 construction battalion, and one of his sons is linked to the community of Hogan's Alley in BC. I hope I have time to talk a little bit more about that. In a way, Ashley's life and that of her siblings is a beautiful representation of the links between our communities, because her father being linked to that Africville and Nova Scotia heritage, and her mother being linked to the Black migration of 1910 is quite representative of many Black experiences in Canada. And now with Ashley's children's father being a person, an immigrant from an immigrant family who came from the motherland, there's just a beautiful representation in those lives of how our lives as African people link to each other everywhere in the world, no matter where we are. And I wish I had more time to dwell on that. John Ware's wife's name was Mildred Lewis. Mildred Lewis is from a family that links us to the Southern Ontario Black history, because her father, Daniel Lewis, was part of an incredibly successful Black community in Southern Alberta with roots going back to around the 1830s. And they came out to Alberta in 1889. John and Mildred met and married. And eventually, after both John and Mildred died tragically in 1905, their 5 surviving children were orphaned and came to live with their grandparents, Charlotte and Daniel Lewis, in this house that Daniel built with his own hands. He was an incredible carpenter. There's a building on King Street in Toronto that it is believed that he built, because it was a building that was commissioned and owned by his brother, John Lewis, who was a very successful Black businessman as well. So Daniel Lewis transported his skills as a carpenter to Southern Alberta. There are homes in Calgary that still have the staircases that were built by Daniel Lewis, because many of the wealthiest people in Calgary lived in Mount Royal. Checking my time here. And he built, he was an important builder. Their life in Calgary links to the life of Charles Daniels, who was a Black man who in 1914, so many, many more years before Viola Desmond, mounted her battle against segregation in theaters in Canada. Charles Daniels did this in Calgary. 1914, he was refused admission to the Grand Theatre, which still exists in Calgary. You can still go there and see a show. Thanks to Charles Daniels, you can go there and see a show, in which he went up against some of the most powerful people in Alberta, including Senator James Lougheed, for whom Mount Lougheed is named, and you can go to the Lougheed House that the Lougheed family built in Calgary. And R.B. Bennett, a future Prime Minister of Canada, who was a law partner with James Lougheed. If you want to learn more about the story, please see my film. It's readily available on YouTube. It's called Kicking Up a Fuss, the Charles Daniels Story. It's a 14-minute film. Just a quick look at why the work that we do to reclaim our stories and excavate them is difficult. I was looking for a particular person for a story I was working on about Charles Daniels, and found her name on the 1911 Census of Canada, and was very surprised to see that she was documented in that census as Norwegian. And then I began to look at the other people who were living in her building, and I recognized all of them through my research. I recognized about 12 other people living in this apartment building in 1911 in Calgary, all of whom I knew were Black because of my research, but all of whom were documented as Norwegian. I think what happened is that the person, you can see in the upper part of the document that the writing is very cramped. I think the person who did the census, took the census information, had poor handwriting. They had written Negro beside all of these people. And then the person who transcribed it, who typed it up, couldn't get their head around the fact that all these people were Black. And so said, well, it must be Norwegian. So that gives you a bit of an idea of how important it is for us to do our own research. If any other human being in this world except me had looked at that transcription, they would not have known that those were Black people. And so these are parts of the reasons why our stories get buried, why our numbers are often undercounted, and why it's important for us to be the ones doing the research and telling the stories. This is just, another example of how cramped the writing is on some of these census documents and how difficult it is to parse it out. Just moving for my last few minutes into the community of Calgary. This is my mother, one of my mother's older sisters, who was a very important figure in Calgary's Black history. Her name was Edith. She eventually married one of Calgary's first Black preachers, but not the first Black preacher by any means, Andrew Risby, who was a minister of a Black church in Calgary for more than 40 years. But Edie, my Aunt Edie, was such a community builder. She was a legendary cook, and she nurtured so many generations of Black people living in Calgary. And I wish I had time to do a presentation just on her alone. This was her standing on the steps of a house in Victoria Park in Calgary. In 1920, there was a petition by the citizens of Victoria Park that they presented to the city of Calgary to try to prevent Black people from living in that community. That petition was signed by 75% of white people who were living in that neighborhood. And that petition also included the name of R.B. Bennett, the future Prime Minister of Canada and the law partner of James Lougheed, who Charles Daniels sued. So what I'm trying to do is just build a bit of a picture for you of how interconnected all of our stories are, how we all stand on the shoulders of those who went before us. And it was because of the protest of Black people against that anti-Black petition of 1920 that many people in our community ended up living in Victoria Park. This photo was taken in the 40s. They lived in that house with a family by the name of Carruthers. Many Black people had to live in sort of homes together because it was very hard to get housing, and they wanted to live near the railroad where many of the men worked. This is a family that also lived there at one time. It was very important to me in my life as a child growing up in Calgary. Napoleon and Willa Sneed, both of whom were descendants of the Amber Valley community, both born in Alberta. And their three children, two of whom are still alive, all grew up to have careers in the entertainment industry in North America, including the baby sitting on his mother's lap there, Floyd Sneed, who when he grew up became the drummer of the rock group Three Dog Night, which was one of the most successful rock bands in the 1970s in the world. Calgary life, Black Calgary life, weddings, as I said, joy, weddings, support, activism, people uplifted one another. My mother, who is seated to my right in this photo, often tells me stories of when she was living in Victoria Park with her older sister, Edie, whose wedding this is, Edie and Andrew Risby, Andrew being the Black minister who was here for 40 years, of beautiful times where families after dinner, everybody would just wander over to everybody's house and people would have pie and lemonade and coffee and chat and laugh, and the men would play cards in in the back rooms, or the men who didn't play cards because they believed it was sinful would do other things in other rooms in the homes. Beautiful community stories. The other young woman on the other side is Ashley's grandma, Pearl. And all of these people in this photo, including my mom's oldest sister, Ethel, who was a bridesmaid, who very sadly died of COVID last year, just shy of her 100th birthday. These were libraries. All of these people were libraries. And I was so grateful for the contributions that they made and their willingness to share their stories with me. And if they had not done so, I would not be here sharing my story and their stories with you today. Oh, so much time that I could spend. The King family, so the man in the middle of this photo that's being hugged by his mom and his, at that time, fiance, Ted King. This is him returning from his service for Canada in World War II. Ted King was a very important activist in Calgary, who is the reason why I was able to go to swimming pools and other public spaces, because we were prevented from using those spaces in times just prior to my life. He was having none of it. And as a president of the Alberta Association for the Advancement of Colored People, fought those laws. Most of our folks, including Charles Daniels, lost their lawsuits, but it was because of their lawsuits that change came about. On this side of the photo is Violet King Henry. Violet was Ted's younger sister, and she became the first Black female lawyer in Canada. This is a photo of her receiving the honor for being one of the top 4 students in her law class at the University of Alberta in, I think it was in 1949-ish, 52-ish. Standing right beside her is Peter Lougheed, a former premier of Alberta, who is the grandson of James Lougheed, who Charles Daniels sued in 1914. So another connection. The 3 men beside Vi receiving their gold ring were all children of privilege. They were all people like Peter Lougheed, who were grandsons of lawyers and senators. And Vi King was the daughter of a porter and a woman who did laundry to keep their family fed and to send them to school. A gathering of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in Calgary in the early 1950s, another activist group that was very important to the reasons why we have some of the privileges and respect that we enjoy in this city today. Still so much work to be done, but I don't want anyone who's on this call to think they are alone in that work. This is work that is being done by our people going back to the 1800s and right through every decade. We had many connections to other racialized groups, including Chinese Canadians. Hop Wo was the owner of this little laundry. He was also the owner of 2 restaurants in Calgary that were 2 of the only places where Black people could eat. So the porters would come to town and they would need somewhere to eat. And Hop Wo had Chinese restaurants that welcomed us. I swear it's the reason why in my community anyway, Black people still eat so much Chinese food. Honestly, I feel it goes back to those connections that were created between us and the Chinese community in the 20s and 30s and the 10s, actually, the 10s as well. We eventually had to make our own chicken restaurants, as I mentioned earlier. And so Luella Coleman, eventually she, after Mr. Coleman died, she married Mr. Bellamy. Mr. Bellamy was an amazing man. Wish I could talk more about him. He's the reason why I know about the connection to Hop Wo. Again, it was my interest in stories and their willingness to share these stories that has kept this history alive. These are some of the women that were in the Calgary Ladies Auxiliary branch of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and also most of them worked in Luella's chicken fry, the world famous chicken fry. The Carruthers sisters, the Carruthers family, an incredible family from Amber Valley. Very important to my life as a kid growing up in Calgary, including some of them that were part of the church before we got the building in Inglewood, where my uncle was eventually the pastor for 40 years. We held church in the Labor Temple in Calgary, which is a building that you can still see. This is a picture of us after church one day. We were probably actually on our way from church to Chinatown, where we often went to have dinner after church. That's me. I'm the youngest one in the front there, holding my mom's hands. They made community for us. And, you know, not very many people, if you showed them this photo, would say, oh yeah, that's Calgary in 1958. Every child in this photo at the annual Christmas concert represents probably 10 or 12 other people, our grandparents, our aunts and uncles, other siblings that were too young to be in this photo, older siblings who were too cool to be in the photo. But this was Calgary. We had a thriving and large-ish, compared to what people think, Black presence here. And I wanted to share some of those photos, and then just a few photos of some of my libraries that are still living, like Peggy Brown, who grew up in Amber Valley and who is an important resource for me, and Vern Bowen, who is the man standing in this photo beside a picture of his brother, who's commemorated because he was the engineer who designed and implemented the light rapid transit system in Calgary. So if you ride the C train in Calgary, it's because of an engineer named Oliver Bowen, who was a descendant of Amber Valley, again, the child of poor Black farmers who fled hatred in Oklahoma to try to build a life here. Vern Bowen, who is still living, is just an incredible resource. And I feel time slipping away as these elders grow older. And I do my best to learn and to preserve their stories. And I want to reiterate something I said earlier, which is that it is really genuinely my hope that my presentation has sparked enough interest for some of you that you will want to dig in further. You can find out more about John Ware as well from my film called John Ware Reclaimed, which is available to anyone in Canada on the National Film Board of Canada website. There are other resources, and I'd be happy to share them with Ashley in the next week or so that she could share with you. I'm going to end there. 1 minute over. I'm very, very interested in and excited to hear from Moneta next. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. We started a little bit late, so technically you're not. As I said, it's Auntie Cher. I can't call you anything other than Auntie Cher. It's weird to me. I've sat through numerous of her presentations, and every time I learn something new. So thank you so much for sharing. Are you okay to stay to the end of Moneta's presentation to take questions if there's any questions? Okay, awesome. So next we are going to have Moneta present on racism and anti-racism. She is a professor at Ambrose University and has many more accolades that I don't have to share with you this morning, or is it? Yeah, it's still morning. So I'm just gonna let Moneta take it away, and then we'll have a brief question period at the end.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you very much, Cheryl, for that presentation. I so much value knowledge keepers in all forms, and hearing you go through that history it always, like, and seeing the pictures, it really transfers me back into time. And I can almost, as you're showing the pictures and sharing with us, I can almost picture myself there. And for me, that ability to be there, be present in the past, it's so much a part of gaining knowledge as well, because you can experience what people, through you and other knowledge keepers like yourself, you can experience what people are feeling and experiencing and going through. And it just gives insight into the world and insight into understanding where we are now. So I truly value that. And I could sit and listen to you for a couple more hours. I could be quiet and let you take this. So thank you for that. I also want to recognize, as you did, that I am on the a settler in the territory in which I am currently coming to you from, in Calgary, located in Calgary. I'm not in Calgary right now. I'm really down south in Waterton with my family, but recognizing, and as this is coming to light, the history of the land in which my family migrated in the 80s, the history in the land, and the history that you brought to light. There's so much history and so much knowledge that we need to remember. And part of what I'm going to do today, as we speak about racism and anti-racism now, is really locate that discussion in some of that history and in some of the past experiences, because we can't understand, and we've heard this all the time, we can't understand where we are now without understanding where we came from. When we speak about racism and anti-racism, you know, I'm going to do it in less than an hour because there's going to be some opportunity for questions, but there's so many facets that we can delve into. I'm going to focus specifically on how race has been socially constructed in the past, and how that then figures into how we understand race and racism today. And one of the reasons I want to do this is, I don't know if any of you have read Ta-Nehisi Coates. He has a quote where he says that, you know, we're in this place right now where we're trying to understand race and racism. How do these things relate to each other? What came first, kind of thing? And most of us think that, or approach the topic thinking race was constructed and then racism followed. Coates suggests that racism as an institution started first, and then we constructed our race on our race identities. And so as we go through the historical conceptualization of race and how we came to this place, I'm going to kind of flip it a little bit and think about racism as a structure that exists in society, and how we have come to racialize ourselves, how we have come as members of society to slot ourselves into racial groups. That is a element that follows, that then serves a structure of racism. And I am so glad that you did your presentation first, Cheryl, because you have alluded to so many examples of how racism feeds our social construction of race. So that's where I will be going in this discussion. Brief thing about me, for those of you who don't know me, I am a sociologist. And so a lot of the way I present my material is crouched in understanding society and how society has set up itself and how society constructs our social interactions. So looking at race and racism is going to be the start of how we unpack that. So with that being said, we're going to be speaking about racism. Want to start with a bit of a quiz. So hopefully this works. I am going to, not a quiz. I realize like no one wants a quiz on a Saturday. It's a poll. So I am going to share a screen with you. And I haven't been teaching for like a month. So of course I forget everything about Zoom. Just trying to make sure I have the correct slide or the correct page. There we go. So on this poll, what I'm going to ask you to do is, can you see the website on this on your end? Did a website come up? Okay, what I'm going to ask you to do is to go to that website, and the website is going to ask, on the website you enter the code and then hit submit. And they ask you to say, enter in 3 words that come to mind when you hear the word racism. So when you hear the word racism, what 3 words come to mind? I'm going to ask you to type that in and then hit submit. And as you do that, a word cloud is going to start to present itself on the screen. So let's give you a minute. I'll do this as well. If anyone's having any questions, any problems and has a question, just shout it out. Has everyone had a chance to do this? Anyone still waiting to submit? Okay. Okay, is that everyone? And you can just unmute yourself and let me know. Can't see everyone on the screen. Okay, so these are words that usually come to mind when we think about racism. So in this cloud, the ones that are entered the most often are going to be the biggest ones. So most people spoke about issues of hate or hatred, which obviously is one of the first things that we think about when we speak about racism. Hatred still up there. Discrimination and ignorance also coming, showing up here. Rooted in history. Thank you very much for who has said that. Very much linked to issues of colonization, supremacy, injustice, global division. I bet I can guess who said that, but I might be wrong. I know some of you who are into the global world and global sphere here. These are all topics that, or ideas or thoughts that come to mind when we think about racism. Quite often when we think about racism, we often think about the personal experiences or things that relate to the person or to the individual. So when we think about things such as hate is something that we tend to experience as an individual. Discrimination is something that we tend to experience as an individual. Ignorance is something that we attribute to individuals. Individuals are ignorant of other people, ignorant of other racialized groups. And these are, it's not surprising that the most mentioned names or most mentioned words are quite closely attributed to the individual. I am happy to see, however, that we also have words that are attributed to the society. Things such as colonization, rooted in history, global division, supremacy, injustice. We are beginning to speak about, as we're speaking about issues of race and racism more commonly in present day, we're beginning to realize that the societal manifestations of race and racism are just as important, if not, as a sociologist, we will suggest that they are more important than some of the individual manifestations of race and racism, such as hatred and discrimination. Not to diminish the personal experiences, but recognize that these personal experiences take place in a larger structure that allow for these personal experiences to take place. So if our society didn't construct ourselves around issues of race and stratify ourselves in a racialized way, we wouldn't have something called racism that we then experience on the personal level. So recognizing that these two things take place. I will quit my job as a professor around race and ethnicity when I see in one of these clouds the big words that are most commonly mentioned are equally distributed between personal experiences of race and racism and societal constructions of race and racism. I wouldn't actually quit my job. I need to, survive. But it will show that, we've progressed to an extent in society where we're looking at these two things in construction. So having said that, then, how would I explain racism, or what are some of the key ways that I use to explain racism? This is a very sociological definition of racism that I often use in the classroom. And it's from a sociologist, Augie Flores, and Augie Flores is a Canadian sociologist. One of the best, in my opinions, to speak about issues of racism. And he defines racism in this is a pared down definition of how he defines racism. And we won't have to go through all of this. I just want to give him credit for how he defines it. But there are a couple things here that, for the purpose of this discussion, we're gonna pull out. So first of all, recognizing that it's a system of dominance and subordination. So the key here is the idea that it's a system, it's systemic. And this goes back to the idea that if we didn't, as society, organize ourselves in a hierarchy, we wouldn't have racism. If we didn't organize ourselves in a hierarchy based on race, we couldn't experience personal racism because there's no system to feed our personal racism. I've been doing a lot of these talks, especially in the last year, and I joke quite a bit because prior to, undoubtedly, not necessarily with your organization, but a lot of institutions that are speaking about race and racism currently are doing it post George Floyd and post, the uprising of last summer, Black Lives Matter really coming to the forefront. And then subsequently, we've seen the racialization of many groups subsequent to that really in the forefront in the last year or so. Prior to this last uprising or reckoning of racism as people are referring to it, as a sociologist who studies race, and I study race and the interaction with the justice system, I always, prior to this, we always used to speak about racism, as I mentioned, as a very personal thing. The allegations of, oh, well, this person is racist, and then the defense, no, I'm not racist, and that was the battle. Is someone racist? Are they not racist? And it was a battle of this personal identity that we attempted to attach to people. After last summer and everything that happened, we've recognized that racism is very much systemic. So society is, speaking about racism in this systemic way. And prior to this, I was always pushing for society to recognize the systematic manifestations of racism, the systemic manifestations of racism. However, after that, I'm like, let's not forget that racism is also personal. We can't separate the two. There's a back and forth of the systemic and systematic piece, but also there's the individual piece, and that individual piece goes to that ideology piece. Racism is an ideology where a society and individuals assume that one race is superior over another. We manifest this either consciously or unconsciously, and this goes to issues of bias, implicit bias. We won't get into this. Want to circle back to the idea of institutional power. So we need the power to have racism play out, which we will get back to and link to a lot of what Cheryl presented. And the end result of racism is that one group benefits over the other. And what this often looks like is that those groups who were benefiting prior to the process of racialization remain in power, and those who were not benefited or were disadvantaged continue to be disadvantaged. So this is that very sociological definition of racism. I always present that at the beginning because I think it's important to really be on the same page and have a very similar understanding of race and racism as we're entering into these conversations. So just no. Why is I've been moving things around on my Zoom and I, for some reason, have lost my stop share. I'm so sorry, everyone. Like I said, been out of the classroom for a second. Am I still sharing my screen? Stop share right there. There it is. Okay, I moved it to the bottom. So it is with that in mind that I want to speak a little bit about this idea of race being socially constructed, this system of race being socially constructed. How many of you have heard in last year, this idea that race is socially constructed? We all have, right? What does that now mean to say that race is socially constructed? Quite often what I hear people respond is, or the debate is, yes, race is socially constructed, but it is still real. So is it socially constructed? Is it something that society makes up? Or do we socially, or is it something that is real, something that happened before we entered into society? One of the fun ways that I tend to introduce this idea of social construction, race being socially constructed, is by showing a video, which I will show shortly. But it shows that, and it underscores the fact that as a social construction, as the idea that we construct race to feed racial groups to feed into a system, we do this throughout history with intentionality. We do it throughout history with a purpose. And what that means is that racial groups don't exist prior to society, but racial groups exist after societies have been created. I often tell the story of my dad, who is from the Caribbean. My dad from St. Lucia. He is part Black, part white, and part indigenous, Carib indigenous. And so my dad growing up in Barbados, he moved to Barbados. I grew up in Barbados, born and grew up in Barbados. My dad never identified as Black, and he was never referred to as Black. He was referred to as red, and he never identified as a Black person. He moved to Canada in the 80s, Edmonton, very few Black people. Maybe 5 years into living in Canada, and my dad walks around the house. Oh, it's so hard being a Black man in Canada. It's so tough. Oh, Black people just don't get any breaks in Canada. And my sisters and I were like, Dad, when did you become Black? Because you weren't Black in Barbados, but you're Black. Like, can you explain this? And so this idea that race is socially constructed really feeds into, and you probably have a lot of experiences of that as you travel, understanding race differently depending on where you are. As I mentioned, one of the fun ways I tend to introduce this is with another short video. So I'm gonna pop this video up, but it really underscores this idea that in terms of understanding race and how we have constructed racial categories, there's no real such thing as a pure race. Although I heard Ike, I remember speaking about this, Ike is purely Congolese, did the DNA test and you came back 100% Congolese.
She regretted that very badly. She's the one who set up the test, and yeah, I came back 100%. But that being said, I understand that the science behind that DNA stuff is not 100%. I did only one of them. It was Ancestry. They don't have a big database of Congolese things, so it could change. But for now, 100% Congolese, man.
Do you know what?
Very good.
You get that because that's ethnicity. But race and ethnicity, sometimes we use them interchangeably. If we were to do it, and that's part of the problem, is that we don't have a marker for race. We can mark ancestry, which is ethnicity, but because there are no genetic, the genetic differences between racial groups is like 6% at most. So there's no conclusive way looking at our genetics as saying this person is 100% this race or 100% that race, because there are no genetic markers to denote 100% racialized groups. And so you can be Congolese 100% ethnicity, although no, you're not. Because I mean, technically, theoretically, it is possible, but in terms of race, it's a very tricky thing. So I'll show this video and then we'll come back and speak about this idea of racial construction. Once again, been out of the classroom for a minute. So, oh no, this is not what I want to do. Let me pull this up. There we go. make sure I'm sharing the sound. Okay. If you can't hear this as I press play, please like raise your, or just shout at me, let me know.
I'm proud to be English. My family have served and we've defended this country and have been to war for this country.
I'm really patriotic about Bangladesh.
Well, I am 100% Icelandic, yeah, definitely.
This is a Kurdish wedding with my mom in the traditional Kurdish clothes.
We're just proud black, so that's it.
Yeah, I think we are probably the best country in the world, if I'm honest.
Think about other countries and other nationalities in the world. Are there any that you don't feel you get on with well, or you won't like particularly?
Germany. Yeah, I'm not a fan of the Germans.
You might think they're a little bit.
Particularly India and Pakistan, probably because of the whole, the conflict.
Because I have this side of me that's like, that hates Turkish people. Not people, but the government. But French?
Nah.
We're just the best, it's just fact.
I'm more important than you. I don't know you, but in my opinion, I am strong and I am more important than a lot of people.
How would you feel about taking a journey based on your DNA?
Yeah, I feel very intrigued.
What could you possibly tell me that I don't know?
So do you know how DNA works? So you get half from mum and half from dad, so 50% from each of them, and they get 50% from their parents, and back and back and back. And all those little bits of your ancestor, they filter down to make you, you. I need you to spit in this tube for me. You spit up to the little black line.
That's a lot of spit.
Right, the story of you is in that tube. What's it gonna tell me?
It's gonna be, oh yeah, you're French, and wait, your grandparents are French, and wait.
100% Bengali.
Solid Iraqi. I'm Cuban.
You're gonna tell me that I'm English, like I've told you.
Jay, can you come down and join us?
I'm a little bit nervous, I have to say.
So you ready to find out your results? Will you read it out to us, please? Wow, look at me.
Oh my God. Oh, wow. Shit, I didn't expect that.
All of them.
Whoa! No.
Caucasus, which was Turkish?
Yeah.
Eastern Europe, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Greece.
I'm 32% British.
What?
Great Britain, 30%. Can we 5% German?
I'm Irish.
Yeah.
So I'm a Muslim Jew.
Great Britain, 11%. Are you sure these results are mine?
Eastern Europe?
Iceland has definitely moved closer to Europe now.
I'm gonna go a bit far right now, but this should be compulsory. There would be no such thing as extremism in the world if people knew their heritage like that. Who would be stupid enough to think of such thing as a pure race?
In a way, we're all kind of cousins, in a broad sense. In a much more direct sense, you have a cousin in this room. Turn around and guess who it is. Waj,
Yeah. What's that?
why don't you come down here and meet your cousin?
God, this is amazing.
Did you know that?
I didn't know I did. This is like, my heart's pounding right now, I swear to God. We met.
I'm Jay from everywhere by the reason is.
I'm a real man of the world.
Wow, that's beautiful. Thank you.
So would you like to travel to all of these places?
Yeah. Hell yeah.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so while that video does speak a lot about race and ethnicity, is very similar, it does underscore a very important fact. When we tend to speak about racial groups or ethnic groups as being, part of our identity as who we are, when we look genetically, we are a lot more mixed than we are individuals. So all of us, with the exception of Ike, of course. So what does this mean? How did we get here? How did we get to this place where we think about race and ethnicity, for that matter, as being so concrete? I'm going to go back a little bit, and this is the historical piece. I'm going to go back a bit in terms of how we begin to conceptualize our racial groups. So prior to, let's say, the 1500s or so, we didn't conceptualize race the way we do. We didn't speak about race the way we do. Prior to about the 1500s, when we spoke about race, when people spoke about race, they really focused on kinship. So being a part of a race literally meant being a part of a family group, a kinship group, a larger community, or a larger society. And so we identified ourselves with our ancestors that way. Racism or race conceptualization as a modern day way of identity occurred alongside a number of things that were going on in the world. It occurred alongside the Industrial Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution was a period of time where human beings thought that we had gained all the wisdom in the world, and we still have this idea, but we have so much wisdom, we're so smart, we want to start to categorize everything and understand everything and make sense of everything in the world. And so we saw this in the natural sciences, started with how we started to categorize specifically plants and plant species. And our categorization of genetic or human beings based on genetics really borrowed from the natural sciences and borrowed from our categorizations of plants, believe it or not. So started to categorize plants, and the purpose of this was to grow more crops, grow crops that could feed vast portions of the world, that we could produce crops, all to feed a system of, who can produce crops more efficiently, produce the most crops, and make the most profit. So we started to categorize plants and other aspects of the world. Industrial Revolution occurred, and human beings are in Age of Enlightenment, alongside the Industrial Revolution, human beings thought we could categorize everything, including people. And so we started to categorize people based not on their lineage, not on their kinship group membership, but based on their physical markers, things that you could see. One of the reasons that this was such an important, at the time, an efficient way of categorizing people is that we could then categorize based on skin color. You didn't have to know a person. You didn't have to know their heritage. You didn't have to know their people. You didn't have to have people spit into a test tube like that guy who was incredibly gross. I saw it gross out Ashley as much as it grossed me out. Split into a test tube and then have it tested in order to categorize. You can look at someone and say, oh, their skin color, their eye color, their eye shape, their hair texture, their nose shape. You can use all of these physical identifiers to categorize people. And so race seemed to be a pretty efficient way of categorization. So we started to categorize, and of course, following that, we started to assume or ascribe different traits to the categories that we produced. So that was one thing that was occurring. It was the Age of Enlightenment. Alongside this was the period of colonization. And so colonization, once again, to feed who can make the most money, the most profit, and so on. Colonization took place, and with colonization, because of both the Age of Enlightenment and colonization started in Europe, these groups, so the Europeans were the ones who, you know, decided the categories and the attributes associated with the categories. And this fed the system of colonization, where in order to produce goods efficiently, in order to expand markets and so on, the Europeans at the time thought, well, if we categorize certain people as lesser than, it's easier to exploit people. It's easier to bring people into our categories. It is easier to have people serve our needs, and it's easier to bring people as they attempt indigenous people into our way of being if we categorize them as lesser than. Really short, like, introduction into this system of categorization that then led to a system of hierarchy. So when Coates speaks about the fact that race fed a racist system, a racist structure, he's really speaking about the fact that this system of categorization was used to feed a structure that was meant to benefit the Europeans at the time, benefit them economically. We had a system in society where we wanted to extend markets through colonization. We wanted to, as a society, we wanted to extend profits. We wanted to control, kind of with the Enlightenment, we wanted to exert control over others. So that system already existed. And how do we best do that? By placing people into a hierarchy where those at the bottom of the hierarchy then serve the needs of those at the top of the hierarchy. So race as a social construction, as it started around these two key events, was a categorization of people in order to place them into a hierarchy, essentially to feed a system where we can control the globe or control the world, control our external environments. And we wanted to do this in a social element, in a social environment, similarly to what was taking place in a natural environment. And so when we think then, Cheryl, you spoke about the fact, or you spoke about how Blacks from Oklahoma at the time moved up to Canada, Western Canada. This movement up to Western Canada, once again, it was to feed a system that already existed. It was purposeful, it was intentional. We wanted to, as you mentioned, with Blacks, we wanted to use Blacks as part of the system to break the land, which was something that disadvantaged our Indigenous brothers and sisters who were already here. So it was to feed that system, something that was already occurring. But we also took place in a system of anti-Black racism as well that we knew existed around the globe, that was fueled by colonization. And so Blacks at the time couldn't have much freedom. They couldn't have too much freedom that they could then overtake. So it was all a system or an element of control. We see this kind of, if you fast forward into, I mentioned the last year or so, and all of the things that we've seen take place, where we've seen anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, and the reminder and ongoing anti-Indigenous racism. These are all based on that system of categorization that then feed a system. One of the clearest examples that I've used over the last little while is how we've seen the creation or the pulling on anti-Asian racism in recent months to feed a system that already exists, or to feed a purpose. We all know that anti-Asian racism has occurred historically. We have a historical manifestations of anti-Asian racism in Canada, with internment camps, with Chinese head tax. We have that history in Canada. But because there's a system that is fed by an ideology that ebbs and flows, sometimes it's more prominent, sometimes it's less prominent. It's all in the service of this larger system. With the pandemic that we've all experienced in the last 18 months or so, so we saw this pandemic emerge. And when we think about the global system, we needed to establish categories in order to, we needed to kind of exert that control. Going back to, colonization, it was all the idea around colonization and Age of Enlightenment is how can we exert control? And with little control in the pandemic, we wanted a way to exert control as well. And I say we as the collective we, as a global we. One of the ways that we thought as a global we that we can exert control is to find a group, find a person, find a genesis of the problem, find someone to blame, find a group to blame. How did this pandemic start? How did the virus start? Where did it come from? And that is this element of exerting control that we see play out. Evidence started to emerge, and I'm not an epidemiologist. I don't know that, I'm not well versed on the science of the coronavirus. But what we heard, the narrative that took place in society was it started in this meat market in China. And so as an element of controlling the pandemic, we identified a cause for the pandemic. And very quickly after that, we started to attribute that cause to a group, to a people group. Once again, this element of control to serve a larger purpose. Started to hear people speak about, I'm not naming any names here, but we started to hear people reference it as the China virus, the Wuhan virus. We started to associate specific characteristics to this virus and link it to specific groups. And that is all in that categorization and assigning kind of characteristics to the different categories, particularly to Asian, originally to individuals from China, but it quickly spread in many Asian individuals. And so one of the things that a lot of sociologists are looking at is how we, in the last year or so, particularly sociologists, Asian sociologists, looking at how that discourse fed a system where anti-Asian racism has always occurred. It has always been there. It was just kind of pushed down to, it wasn't in the public, but with the categorization and the assignment of characteristics to the category of Asian individuals, anti-Asian racism then flourished to feed a system that was intended to control another group. And so to look at that cycle of how we, over time, continue to create and recreate categories and assign characteristics to these categories of individuals to feed a larger, trying not to be too inflammatory here, but essentially to feed a larger racist system. We see this play out in many groups. We see it with Asian Americans now, or Asian individuals now. We've seen it with Blacks over time. As Cheryl took us through the history of Blacks in Western Canada. We saw how different characteristics were attributed to Blacks at the time in order to exert this level of control. And we see it with pretty much most racialized groups over time, is that categorization. So that underscores this idea that race is something that is socially constructed. It is not something that we can test for in terms of DNA. It is not something that we can test for in terms of understanding or genetic makeup. In order to understand our systems or our categorizations of race, we need to look at how it is constructed in order to serve a larger system. So what does that mean then in terms of anti-racism? When we understand race and racism in that way, how do we then become anti-racist, which is a lot of what we are attempting to do right now? How do we understand elements of anti-racism? Because we refer to racism as a system of domination, the only way to be anti-racist is to attend to, respond to the system of domination in society, where we categorize races in a hierarchy and assign these characteristics. The only way to become anti-racist is to look at how we associate race with certain characteristics in society. One of the key ways that over time we've found to combat this, so we can speak about the systemic parts, but one of the key systemic parts are the ideologies, the thoughts, the ideas that feed this system, because these things all have to be created in order to feed a racist system. And at the heart of ideologies are incredibly resilient, incredibly difficult to change, incredibly difficult to combat. And when we think of an ideology of racial prejudice, There are things that are ingrained not only in the individual, but in our society. And how do we combat these racist ideologies or ideologies built on racial prejudices? As a test before I get to that around the resilience of ideologies, when we think about an ideology is simply something that we believe to be true about society. And when we think about an ideology, it feeds prejudices because it's something that we believe to be true about another group without even knowing. It's literally a prejudgment, a prejudice, a prejudgment. It occurs before interactions with another group. So an ideology is something we believe to be true about another group prior to interaction with that other group. That's how prejudices are formed. And when we think about change in ideologies, prejudices, these prejudgments, they're incredibly difficult to change because we hold on to things that we believe to be true. So let's ask you to think about something you hold to be true. So just give you a second, something that you hold to be true. Now, what would it take for you to no longer believe? I'm not going to ask you to share, but to no longer believe in that truth. What would it take for you to say, oh, I was completely wrong. That truth is absolutely false.
Jesus would have to come back and
Yeah.
tell me personally.
Yeah, that's typically like Jesus will have to tell you that is not true. Yeah, for us. And so these are prejudices, right? When people hold a prejudgment, a pre-existing ideology about another group, it literally takes Jesus, or maybe not quite Jesus, but it takes that level of convincing to tell that someone that this isn't true. And this is why prejudices that then feed racism tend to be so firmly entrenched in our society because they're very resilient to change. So one of the things that feeds prejudices then are stereotypes. And this always gets into a tricky kind of conversation because a stereotype really is a prejudgment, preconception of another group prior to interaction with that other group. And once we interact with that other group, or a member from that other group, and they don't feed our stereotypes, they don't buy into our stereotypes, what do we tend to say about that person? Do we say, oh, my judgment, my ideology about this group is completely wrong? No, we say, oh, well, that person is the exception. Right, yeah. And so stereotypes, prejudices, ideologies, incredibly resistant to change. And this is because they're part of our societal discourse that we have been socialized into. We've been socialized into over time. And so racial prejudices are very resistant to change as well. And that's why they continue from generation to generation. And something like the coronavirus can pop up in the year 2000, and we can pull on old stereotypes and racial stereotypes and ideologies about Asian people. We can pull on these pre-existing ideologies to feed into and to serve a purpose to help us categorize and explain things such as the coronavirus present day. This always leads to discussions of, well, are there good stereotypes or bad stereotypes? You know, like there's some good stereotypes, like the stereotypes that aren't negative, like, and you can fill in the blank. And I mean, we say, as a sociologist, all stereotypes are negative. All stereotypes are harmful, regardless of whether they frame people in a positive light at the time or not. So having these prejudgments, these pre-stereotypes are always harmful. So in terms of anti-racism then, and what anti-racism looks on the ground and how we implement anti-racism is just breaking these prejudgments, breaking these ideologies. If we continue to feed these prejudgments and feed these ideologies, it is incredibly easy as we socially construct races over time to pull on these pre-existing ideologies to justify a system of harm towards groups at different times in history. It's incredibly easy that when a virus originates in China at a particular time to pull on pre-existing ideologies to feed into the racialization and racism against in Asian individuals in the year 2000 and 2001. It's incredibly easy to do this because these things already exist. Who knows next year what could happen? Something could originate or something could happen in another racialized part of the world. And all it takes is to pull and draw on these pre-existing ideologies to help us explain and to help us continue to feed a system of racism. So the work of anti-racism is really just interrupting these prejudgments. The work of anti-racism is just stopping these ideologies, questioning these ideologies at every step of the way, questioning these stereotypes at every step of the way. And some of this can seem pretty trivial in terms of, and I do this to myself, I meet someone, and even before meeting someone, sometimes I have an idea or a preconception of what that person is going to be, how they're going to present themselves, based on their presumed or assumed race or ethnic identity. Where if we go back to before, there's nothing pure. So we're all a mix of a lot of stuff, except for Ike. But there's nothing pure. So to prejudge or to presume a person's identity prior to meeting them is completely arbitrary and completely wrong, because we're all a mix, and I don't know what mix influences a person at any time. And so at every interaction, to have that interruption where it's like, if I have prejudged, if I have presumed, if I have drawn on an ideology to kind of inform my expectations of what an interaction is going to be like, I have to stop it in the middle. It's about cutting that or severing that kind of flow of information from prejudgment to interaction. And so when I think about the work of anti-racism, it's doing this on a personal level, but it's also doing this on a systemic level. What does the system presume about individuals before they enter into an institution? What is the assumption of someone who might have a name that is that presents as, because we don't know the person, we don't know the history, so a name that presents as African or Asian or Muslim? What does the system, what does assume about that person prior to their interaction in the institution? A person going into a classroom, a person going into a doctor's office, a person going into a church, just by the name, what do we presume, both the system and the individual, what do we assume those interactions will look like? And yes, human beings, going back to the inception of race, we want to categorize. We categorize to control. That's what we want to do. It's very difficult to live in a world where we can't predict. So we categorize and we control. And so we're going to always have these tendencies to presume prior to meeting, because we want to be able to control that interaction. But it's always breaking that kind of flow of information, breaking those presumptions ahead of time, or being aware and then breaking those presumptions. That really is the work narrowed down of anti-racism, both from an individual level, but also from a systemic level. So I'll leave it at there, because I believe there's going to be a chance for questions, and only about 10 minutes. I wanted to give 15 minutes, but.
Thank you, Moneta. That was awesome. It made me think a little bit more about those preconceived notions and that I even have, because I tend to think that, no, not me, I don't have any of that, but that's obviously not true. So thank you for that. Does anyone have any questions regarding either presentation?
I can maybe get us to do a little round. I think what I want to say too is thank you to both presenters. Honestly, this was top notch. This was really, really a good information here. We feel we were messaging each other in the back. We were so disappointed in the turnout today. People were telling us like throughout the week, oh, I have to work, oh, I have a funeral. So we're like, so we put it on social media to try to get more bodies out here. But still, you guys came through, didn't give us a B class presentation. It was still really solid. So we want to definitely show our appreciation for those who are still here. If you can turn your camera on, and then let's try to get some engagement happening. I think the first presentation in that historical piece, the connection, I think is great. And then making it so relevant and making like bring current relevant examples up. I think that was really, really strong as well. So we'll start, I think, Junior, you might be the youngest one today. So we'll start with you, then we'll go Vince, Jolie, and then
So first of all, sorry for the background noise. First of all, I want to say thank both of you guys for the presentation. Like, I learned a lot, especially the historical pieces as well. I didn't know that like black like blacks in Canada, like African people, or like in Canada, like were rooted in, like they started in like the maritime provinces, which I thought that was really interesting. And I also really like that interactive piece that we did, like what everyone thought about, like what everyone thought about what racism was. Yeah, those two pieces were really interesting for me.
Thanks, Junior. I think I could disappear to probably wrangle Araya. Vince, do you want to go next?
Oh yeah. So like as Junior said, like the amount of Black history that's within Canada is like a crazy amount, which I never knew about. You mostly in school, they mostly teach you about what happened in the States and how that went, but they don't really touch too much on what happened in Canada and how it was brought up. And we learned so much about how we identify ourselves and how people identify us, but sometimes we overlook that. Like, you forget that there's stereotypes, and they still till this day, like people still stereotype you off your name or just the color of your skin. And like the points that she pointed out were really important. So it's an important thing in our community.
Awesome. Sorry, I thought Ike was going to take over, but Jolie, what do you think?
I think it was really great. I want to thank Cheryl and Moneta for taking the time to speak with us and present. I think I feel really, really proud of the African and Black community here in Canada. Like, I had no idea that we basically went through a lot of adversity, but just continue to come on top and continue to thrive in a country that was basically trying to push us out. And I think it's really inspiring, and I hope that the stories can continue on to the next generations, and that someone can take on the role of being a storyteller in the Black and African community, so that we can keep the knowledge that we have. Thanks again.
Dope. Okay, Papa Fo.
Yeah, like for me, I want to say thanks again to the both presenters. Like, I really liked, especially like with the more historical presentation, just hearing about stuff like the Black Wall Street and stuff like that. Stories I've heard before, but it always feels like slightly disconnected. Like it happened a long time ago, but like hearing this and hearing how it affects like people I know, it like really like makes it hit so much harder. It makes the story that like it just doesn't feel as like far away anymore, and like you can like seeing the effects and like realizing how it has long lasting effects, like really, really long. And then also on the other side, on how we view racism and all that, it was like a really good, like, especially I think when talking about how we view just race itself being a social construct, it was an idea I've always heard but never really understood. People talk about that, and so it's like really like eye opening, getting that more in depth and talking about that.
Yeah, it was just so amazing how the presentations just went together so seamlessly, and it just made so much sense like that. So that's good. I think we haven't heard from Carol today. Carol, how's Ottawa? How's Ontario?
Wow. I mean, you're not wrong right now, but we're finally opening up a little bit here. Thank you so much, Cheryl and Moneta. That was fantastic. I honestly wish we could redo the session and have more of our youth hear this, because a good portion of them are missing, and this is they don't teach this in schools, and I don't know what we need to do for that to happen. Really, I don't know what we need to do. So we're in Ottawa, and my daughter, for Black History Month in her school, she was going to school in Gatineau, I think they learned about Harriet Tubman, which she already knew. But that's what they did, and I think they did one day, and that was very sad for me. So I always go out of my way to buy Black books or about Black history, just so she can learn something. And it's very sad to me that we don't talk about that here, and we don't explore much of that in our history classes in school. And I think that we need to, if we don't talk about this, how are we raising awareness in the next generation, right? It's stories that get lost, and even for the racism piece, like how do we? Sorry, there's noise here. So how do we? Sorry, it totally distracted me from what I was saying, but yeah, how does the next youth learn anti-racism, to be anti-racist? If all we do, I remember when I going to school in Calgary. So Cheryl, I think your husband, I think it is, was my counselor. I went to Calgary Christian School. So he was the counselor there, I think.
My brother
brother
Richard, yeah.
I didn't even know you guys were siblings. I thought it was your husband. Yeah, so he was my counselor in high school. But yes, we're going to Calgary Christian School, and all that you hear is, I have an Indian joke. I have an Indian joke. And I never used to understand them, but how do we get away from that if we don't learn that it's those little, I have an Indian joke, that turns into ideas that we form against other people. So I don't know. We have to maybe redo the session.
Yeah.
Honestly, that's what we were thinking. This has to be like mandatory listening to all the youth and all the facilitators who weren't here. Yeah, it was disappointing to see our numbers like drop down. I'm like, no, where are people going? It's getting better now. But we reset, we recover, we don't stop there. So that's all we gotta do. I think if Ashley, do you have any words to share? And then we'll pass it over to Rita, who always has a great final word. I don't know why I always pass it to you. You make a face like this, Rita, but you always handle it. So, it's all good. So after Ashley, we can get that, good closing word to just rub it all in.
About me?
Oh, yeah. I thought you were cooking. I didn't know you were I thought that you were cooking. So yeah, Ashley and Ketty, then Rita, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think I said kind of what I wanted to say already. I think both presentations were awesome. Again, I was messaging Ike in the group. I'm like, oh man, like, what's going on today? I think maybe Saturday morning was tough. But I don't know, I might be talking to you guys to see what we can do to do this again. Or, I mean, it's recorded, so I can always just share it with the youth. But anyway, I think the presentations were amazing. Again, I always learn something new, Auntie, with your presentations. And Moneta, you've definitely given me some stuff to chew on and think about. So again, thank you for doing this. I'll just pass it over to Nketsi. Are you there, Nketsi? Are you cooking now?
No, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I was stuff in the oven and done my chopping and stuff, and I've just come back here to just, I guess, to finish off. Yeah, thank you so much, Cheryl and Moneta. That was absolutely amazing. I'm so glad I didn't miss it. Like, I came from something else. I was like, no, I've got to come because I can't miss this one. And it's interesting you talked about, Cheryl, you talked about John Ware, because you're right, in that he is often referred to as the successful Black man, who came out of slavery, and then he went, is now considered a big, massive legend. And, and he's often spoken about like, racism doesn't exist, just like, Obama being president, racism doesn't exist. But what they fail to talk about are some of the complexities around some of the land that he was given or that he had access to, and that sort of thing. And I have a tiny short story because I know we've gone over time. So Black History Month. So I think you all know I'm part of Rotary. And that is what was spoken about, the story of John Ware. And of course, there you go to say, here is an example of someone who pulled himself up by the bootstraps, which was really sort of steeped in complete and absolute racism. In the heart of Black History Month, they're saying, this man was so great, he was so wonderful, saying almost like, well, what excuse do the rest of you have, kind of a thing. And I think that more needs to be taught around John Ware for sure. And I wanted to ask, I remember the very first meeting, Ashley had said that, I think my people from Sierra Leone are descendants of slaves, and we were taken to Freetown to set up this protectorate, and we came from Nova Scotia. And yeah, so I thought it's a fun fact.
Yeah, maybe we're related somehow.
Yeah, we might be. You never know.
You never know.
That's very cool.
We share a common ancestor.
Yeah. I was saying to my mom today, I was like, we need to do this thing so that we can actually know more about our history and our ancestry and stuff like that. And so thank you for that, Cheryl. And Moneta, that was absolutely amazing as well. I love your tone, your voice. I was like, yeah, she speaks like a lecturer for sure. I was like, I want to be part of her class.
I try not to do the lecturing thing. I'm sorry.
No. You know, people sort of speak negatively about it, but really it's your ability to explain and gradually go through things in a very systematic way. So I don't think there's anything wrong with it. So yeah, and I loved your discussion about, race as a social construct, that racism comes first. And it is on that foundation, on that basis, that then we construct race to create inequality and oppression. And oftentimes people think it's the other way around. And so thanks for that clarification and for the golden nuggets that you shared with us today. Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, Moneta. I'm so excited. I'm really glad that we.
Sorry, Rita, can I just say one thing really quick before I let you go? Yeah, I really appreciated Cheryl's presentation just when you told the story of like African peoples. I think that was one of well, maybe I'll share like a personal anecdote to just riff off of what Nketi was saying, because Ashley and I, we saw each other as being so different for so long, for so many years, as having like two different tracks of our history. It kind of started to change, like just like what Nketi mentioned, like there's another population of like African Americans in Africa who are based in Liberia. And so I read up a little bit upon that group, and they're kind of cousins to the group that came from Nova Scotia who went to Sierra Leone. But like that group in Liberia, they were called Congos. And I'm sitting there scratching my head. I'm like, man, Ashley, we sat there, at loggerheads being like, African, I'm so proud. And she's so proud to be African American. And it was just so interesting to have like, I don't know, like a harmonious story, you know what I'm saying, without us seeing that it showed the connection, the power within there, and it kind of shows like the maturity kind of in our relationship and how it ended up being. It is really, I don't know, there's that personal level, or like Dr. Bailey was saying, there's the systemic. I'm just gonna call you Dr. Bailey from here on out. That's it, man. The way you went through that lecture, you Dr. Bailey. I know, but talking about the systemic and all that, how we're as an individual, you can still feed a system, your story, all that. I think it's a really neat one. And then over to you, Rita.
Okay, I don't know. Normally I try to tailor my comments to the youth participants, and we've lost the majority of them. So I really don't know what I'm going to say, but since all of this is being recorded, maybe they still get a chance to hear. But I feel like all of the sentiments expressed by all of the facilitators are what I was thinking about when Cheryl was presenting and when Moneta was presenting. Like, the youth need to hear these stories. And I kind of wrote in there, like, if you don't know your history, other people will tell you who you are. And I think that for most of our youth who end up being lost or end up in the criminal justice system or falling out of school, it is because they don't know where they came from. So then when somebody tells them that this is who you are, it is easy to just succumb to that narrative of who they say you are. Before long, we become the statistics, and we become those bearing the brunt of the negativity in the system. So to me, that is the overall big thing that I regret, that we don't have most of our youth here. And so I really agree, like, this thing should be done again. But I had an idea. Since we are hoping that we can have a big community event at some point, maybe Cheryl, you would be gracious to actually come in person and show us these beautiful pictures again, not just to our participants, but to the Ambrose community. Because, Moneta, correct me if I'm wrong, but Ambrose is moving towards having an anti-racism policy. And I am just thinking about the power of having this presentation go along the outdoor our participants and tell them, well, you know what, come join us. I just think it would be fantastic to do something like that and just keep on going. But before I just leave, I just wanted to also again say, just for the recording, that when we talk about systemic racism, Moneta, what you said and what I put in the chat is what we should be pulling out and putting in our toolkit. What does the system presume about you before you enter the building? If we are able to reflect on that in our toolkit and reflect on that as we go through all of the systems, then we will be moving the needle on this capacity building journey that we have all embarked on. So to me, there is that big identity piece that Cheryl brought, into such sharp focus. Like, I don't know that anyone can top that. But then there's also that, more broader piece and debunk what the system is assuming about us Black people before we walk into the building. If we just take these two away as our learnings for today, our toolkit is going to be just the best. And we are really hoping to put these little gems in that toolkit, because we expect it to give and give and give until Moneta can quit her job.
Yes, please.
Yeah, but yeah, seriously, it was a fantastic presentation. And if we can really do this as the headliner of our community event, would really bring it home about who we are and why we decided to embark on this journey. So thank you very much, ladies. And I hope that the rest of the youth will actually listen to this presentation and take what it was, as I were hoping to bring to them.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.